So, I want you to picture the year 1750. Just, imagine you're this extraterrestrial observer looking down at the Earth, and you're trying to assess the economic landscape of humanity.
Right. Just taking a snapshot of global wealth.
Exactly. So you scan Eurasia, and then you scan sub-Saharan Africa. And if you look at their wealth, their per capita income, their baseline agricultural output, those two regions are virtually identical.
Yeah. The lines on the graph just overlap perfectly.
Right. For centuries, the economic output of an average person in an English village and a village in the Congo Basin were just functionally indistinguishable.
The historical baseline is actually remarkably flat. I mean, human beings, regardless whether they were in like a temperate European valley or an African savanna, they were largely dealing with the same fundamental struggles of subsistence. And they had very similar results in terms of individual material wealth.
But then you fast forward to today, and that parity is just completely gone. The income gap between the poorest African nations and the prosperous countries of the OECD is staggering. I mean, we are not talking about a small divergence here.
No, it's massive.
The wealth gap is a factor of 40 times the difference in per capita income. And that, of course, cascades into life expectancy, health, and just fundamental human opportunities.
Historians and economists actually call this the Great Divergence. And, whenever a gap that massive opens up in the human record, the immediate instinct is to look for the most visible, obvious causes.
Right. So we point to geography. We say, oh, the soil is too harsh, or we look at the brutal disease environment like malaria, the tsetse fly, or obviously we point to the horrific, undeniable legacy of the transatlantic slave trade and subsequent colonial extraction.
And to be clear, those factors are incredibly destructive. They caused immense demographic and economic damage. But the sources we are unpacking in this deep dive today suggest that treating geography or external exploitation as the complete answer, it leaves this massive structural blind spot.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really fascinating.
We're looking at a landmark 2013 research paper. It's from the National Bureau of Economic Research, authored by Philip Osafo-Kwaako and James A. Robinson, both from Harvard University, and their thesis fundamentally rewrites the architecture of global inequality.
It's a total slap in the face to traditional history. They argued that the true root of this massive divergence isn't just about what was done to Africa from the outside. It actually comes down to a specific internal institutional mechanism.
Yes.
Something that became completely ordinary, almost background noise in Eurasia, but was uniquely and fiercely resisted across much of sub-Saharan Africa. And that mechanism is the centralized state.
The prevailing assumption we all learn is that state building is just a natural, inevitable step in human evolution. Like you get enough people together, they eventually form a central government.
Right, it's just human nature.
Exactly. But what Osafo-Kwaako and Robinson reveal, and they use extremely rigorous cross-cultural data to do this, is that the universal rules of how nations supposedly form completely shattered on the African continent.
So that is our mission for you today. We are going to explore why certain African societies purposefully engineered their cultures to dismantle absolute power. We're going to look at the ingenious social technologies they invented to stay free from tyranny.
And it really is genius.
It is. But we also have to examine the tragic, unintended price they paid for that freedom. Because the very mechanisms they used to protect their equality, well, they inadvertently locked them out of the foundational public goods required to survive the Industrial Revolution.
To really understand what a centralized state actually does on a day-to-day basis, we don't need to look at abstract economic theory. We can look at this perfect natural experiment located right along the Kasai River in what is today the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Yeah, the geography here is crucial to understand. So the Kasai River cuts through the landscape, creating this stark dividing line. On one bank of the river, you have a society called the Bushong, who are the dominant group within the historical Kuba state.
And on the exact opposite bank, you have a group called the Lele.
Right. And anthropologists Mary Douglas and Jan Van Sina conducted extensive fieldwork here in the 1950s, and they documented something extraordinary.
It's honestly mind-blowing.
Yeah. The Bushong and the Lele share the exact same genetic origin. They speak the same language. Their traditional clothing is identical in style. Their houses are built using the exact same techniques. They even started with the exact same baseline agricultural technology.
They are essentially the exact same people living in the same climate on the same soil.
But the reality on either side of that river could not be more different. Douglas and Van Sina found that the Kubiso, the Bushong side, were thriving. They had developed highly specialized nets for hunting, which required massive collective effort to weave and deploy.
They were also practicing advanced crop rotation. They were cycling 5 different crops over a 2-year period.
Which is incredibly complex. And in some areas, they were pulling in 2 to 3 harvests of maize every single year.
So their agricultural output per capita was roughly double that of the people living just a mile away across the water.
Right, because you cross the Kasai River to the Lele side, and it is a scene of utter destitution. The Lele refused to use hunting nets. They didn't practice crop rotation. They were barely scraping by with a single unreliable harvest a year.
Wow.
And if they share the same DNA, the same land, and the same starting technology, I have to ask, why didn't the Lele just look across the river, see the nets and the 3 harvests, and just copy them?
Yeah, it seems obvious, right?
It makes zero sense to just choose poverty when the blueprint for wealth is sitting right there.
Well, the barrier wasn't knowledge, it was politics. The Lele couldn't copy the Kuba because they lacked the specific social architecture required to sustain that kind of labor.
Okay, break that down for us.
So in the 1620s, the Kuba experienced a massive political upheaval under a leader named King Sham. Sham essentially forged a centralized state where none had existed before. He established a capital, a bureaucracy, a police force, and a judicial system.
I am still struggling with the mechanics here, though. Like, a leader declares himself a king, sets up a bureaucracy, and suddenly the soil yields 3 harvests instead of 1. How does mere existence of a government change the physical growing season of corn?
It doesn't change the soil, it changes the incentive structure of the human beings planting the corn. The key is understanding what life was like without the state, which is exactly how the Lele were still living in the 1950s.
Oh, I see.
The Lele existed in what we might call a stateless society. There was no central authority, no police, no court system to enforce contracts or protect property.
So it's effectively a power vacuum.
And nature abhors a vacuum. Without a state, Mary Douglas observed that Lale society fell into a very specific trap. It was this self-reproducing system of dominance by older men.
Interesting.
Because there was no formal law, security relied entirely on personal power and family alliances. The elder men basically hoarded all the resources, the wealth, the prestige, and the women. A young Lale man typically couldn't get married or establish his own household until he was 35 years old.
Jeez. Think about the psychology of that young man. If you are 20 years old in the Lale tribe, you have no property, no status, and no immediate prospect of a family.
Exactly.
More importantly, if you spend 6 months weaving a complex hunting net or 3 years clearing land for a multi-crop rotation, there is absolutely no police force to stop a rival family or group of elders from simply taking it from you.
The security of long-term investment is zero. Therefore, the rational choice for a young Lale land is not to invest time and labor in complex agriculture or technology. Any wealth you create just makes you a target.
So what do they do with their time?
They redirect their energy into the only activities that make sense in a stateless environment, raiding, kidnapping, and short-term conflict. The society's demographic energy is entirely consumed by mutual exploitation and self-defense.
Wow.
Douglas wrote that the absence of nets among the Lale wasn't due to ignorance. It was a general tendency to avoid investing in long-term equipment because there was no central authority to protect that investment.
It's like a low-efficiency black hole. The lack of a state creates an environment where everyone is incentivized to tear each other down rather than build something lasting.
Yes, and King Shyam's revolution among the Kuba solved this exact problem. By centralizing power, he monopolized violence. The state became the ultimate enforcer.
Right.
If a Kuba farmer built a net or cleared a field, the state ensured he got to keep the rewards of his labor. Shyam also forcibly lowered the age of marriage to under 20, which broke the monopoly of the elders and incentivized young men to settle down and work the land instead of raiding their neighbors.
He essentially pulled a massive demographic of young, aggressive men out of a cycle of violence and dropped them into a productive agricultural labor force. The state provided the security blanket that allowed the Kuba to plan for tomorrow, while the Lele were stuck fighting over today.
Exactly. Freedom from a centralized state ironically trapped the Lele in a cycle of poverty.
Yeah.
The Kasai River is just this perfect microcosm showing that centralization, when it functions properly, is an incredible engine for human prosperity.
Now, that makes perfect sense for a lush, tropical environment like the Congo Basin where agriculture can flourish if given the chance. But, a critic might say, sure, a state works when the land is rich. What happens when you apply this concept to a geography that actively fights human survival?
That's a great question.
Let's take this institutional mechanism out of the jungle and drop it into the Kalahari Desert. Let's look at Botswana.
Oh, Botswana provides one of the most stunning data points in modern economic history. In the decades following their independence, Botswana experienced the fastest growing economy in the entire world.
Really? The fastest?
The fastest. And they achieved this in a country that is largely arid desert, prone to severe droughts, with an incredibly sparse population density.
Geography dictates they should be incredibly poor. They are landlocked, they have terrible soil for farming, and their population is spread out over massive, unforgiving distances.
Yet they defied all geographic determinism. And the secret to their success lies in the specific flavor of centralization developed by the traditional Tswana tribes.
What did they do differently?
They built a highly centralized state machinery, but they embedded a unique structural mechanism for accountability called the Kagatla.
The tribal assembly, right?
Yes, the Katla was a public forum, a central gathering place where all adult males in the society had a voice. The chief held central authority. He commanded the resources and the labor, but his power was not absolute in the tyrannical sense.
Okay.
In the Kagatla, the chief could be openly questioned. He could be criticized by commoners. The assembly served as a vital feedback loop and a check on executive power.
So imagine a modern corporation where the CEO has immense power to execute grand strategies. But every Friday, the shareholders get to sit in the boardroom, interrogate him, and potentially veto his decisions if he acts against the company's interests.
That's a perfect analogy.
The CEO can't just loot the treasury because he has to answer to the Agatla.
This combination strong central authority, tempered by systemic accountability, allowed the Tswana to navigate the challenges of the desert and later, the modern global economy. When diamonds were discovered in Botswana after independence, many nations might have fallen into the resource curse.
Where a tyrant hoards the wealth and the country descends into civil war.
Exactly. But because Botswana had the cultural DNA of the Gatla, their centralized state used that diamond wealth to build national infrastructure, secure property rights, and invest in education. They proved that African centralization didn't inevitably lead to predatory dictatorships. It could be uniquely democratic and highly effective.
The Kuba showed us that centralization unlocks agricultural potential, and Botswana showed us it can manage modern economic complexities even in harsh environments.
Which brings us to a massive historical paradox.
Right. If a centralized state is this powerful, if it gives you 3 harvests a year and builds economic miracles in the desert, why didn't this mechanism spread like wildfire across the entire African continent? Why did so many societies, like the Lael, remain stateless?
To answer that, the Harvard researchers had to test what historians consider the universal rules of state building. There is a deeply entrenched Eurasian model, a sort of historical recipe book, that dictates how and why states form.
And the recipe has 3 main ingredients. Number 1, high population density. The logic is simple, right? If you have a few people spread out over a massive forest, they don't need a government.
Sure.
But if you pack thousands of people into a small, fertile valley, the friction of human interaction, so disputes over land, water, crime, it becomes so intense that society must invent a hierarchical government just to manage the chaos.
Number 2 is frequent external warfare. The sociologist Charles Tilly famously coined the phrase, "War made the state, and the state made war."
Right.
The theory suggests that facing a constant existential threat from outsiders acts like a hammer on an anvil. Squabbling tribes are forced to put aside their differences, pool their resources, and elevate a single king to coordinate their defense.
And the third ingredient is lucrative long-distance trade. Trade generates immense wealth. That wealth needs protection, so merchants demand security. Furthermore, a local ruler can tax that trade and use those tariffs to fund a standing army, build roads, and hire bureaucrats.
Density, war, and trade. This trinity explains the rise of states in Europe, parts of Asia, and Mesoamerica. Osafo-Kwaako and Robinson wanted to see if this Eurasian logic held up in pre-colonial Africa.
But they didn't just read a few history books and make a guess. They utilized a massive, rigorous database known as the SCCS, the Standard Cross-Cultural Sample.
The SCCS is a foundational tool in anthropology. It tracks 186 distinct independent pre-industrial cultures across the globe. It measures hundreds of different variables for each society, everything from their climate and agricultural practices to their marriage customs and political hierarchies.
And crucially, the data set includes 40 distinct pre-colonial cultures located within sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, it gives you a perfect cross-section. You have nomadic hunter-gatherers like the Kung, densely packed, stateless societies like the Tiv in Nigeria, all the way up to highly centralized empires like the Asante.
So the researchers ran statistical regressions using this SCCS data. They mapped the presence of political centralization in Africa against those three universal ingredients: population density, warfare, and trade.
And they naturally expected to see the same positive correlations found everywhere else in the world.
Instead, the data revealed a complete breakdown of the Eurasian model. The golden rules of human history simply stopped working when applied to the African continent.
It really is a huge shock to the system when you see the numbers.
Let's dig into the exact mechanics of this failure, starting with the most intuitive rule: population density.
Globally, the data is unequivocal. When population density goes up, the likelihood of a centralized state forming goes up almost proportionally. The trend line is stark and undeniable.
Okay.
But when you isolate the African data within the SCCS, the correlation between density and centralization completely flatlines. It is statistically indistinguishable from zero.
Wait, my brain rebels against this. If you pack tens of thousands of people into a tight geographical area, how do they not kill each other over property disputes? How do you manage sanitation or food distribution or basic civil order without someone, somewhere, acting as a mayor or a chief?
The historical reality of societies like the Igbo in Nigeria, the Tiv, or the Kikuyu in Kenya forces us to abandon our modern assumptions. These groups inhabited incredibly fertile land. Their populations were massive and densely packed, yet they remained fiercely egalitarian and entirely stateless.
How is that even possible?
They managed disputes through complex networks of elders, spiritual mediators, and ad hoc councils that dissolved as soon as an issue was resolved. They absolutely refused to institutionalize a permanent hierarchy.
They figured out a way to handle the friction of high density without surrendering their autonomy to a central power.
Yes. Furthermore, when you look at the African societies that did have centralized states, the causal arrow is often pointing in the completely opposite direction from the Eurasian model.
Oh, wait. Explain that reverse causality. What do you mean?
Well, the Eurasian theory insists that crowding forces the creation of a state. But in Africa, historians observe that the state often came before the crowding.
Oh, interesting.
We saw this with the Kuba. King Shyam established the state when the population was relatively normal. It was only after the state provided security and agriculture boomed that the population exploded. We see similar patterns in 19th century Rwanda.
The state wasn't a desperate response to overpopulation. The state was a technology that made it safe to have a high population in the first place. You don't get millions of people until you build the security apparatus to feed them.
Precisely. The logic of density causing the state fails entirely. Now, let's look at the second supposed catalyst, external warfare.
Right, the whole hammer and the anvil idea.
The SCCS includes a specific variable 893, which measures how frequently a society is attacked by outside forces.
In Europe, if the French keep attacking your borders, you eventually have to unify Germany to fight back. What happens when an African society is constantly attacked?
The statistical correlation is not just flat, it actually leans negative. Frequent external attacks completely fail to forge centralized states in Africa.
Wait, so instead of unifying the tribes, being attacked just shattered whatever fragile temporary alliances existed? Why wouldn't they band together?
Because of the environment. Europe is relatively constrained. You are boxed in by oceans, mountains, and other hostile states. If you are attacked, you have to stand your ground and build a castle.
You have nowhere to run.
Right. Pre-colonial Africa, however, was defined by vast expanses of open, available land. When faced with an external threat, the most rational, low-cost survival strategy wasn't to stay and endure a grueling siege. It was to pack up your village and move into the interior.
Ah. The open frontier acted as an escape valve. You don't need to surrender your freedom to a warlord to protect you if you can just walk away from the danger.
Exactly. The researchers dug deeper, looking for any type of conflict that correlated with state building. They found that external threats scattered people, but there was a significant dark correlation with internal conflict.
You mean civil war?
Yes. Rebellions, internal subjugation, and the brutal conquest of neighboring villages within the same cultural group. In the African context, it seems the state wasn't forged by people banding together to fight an outsider.
Right.
It was forged when one internal faction acquired enough power to violently overwhelm its own neighbors and force them into a hierarchy. It was an exercise in internal dominance, not external defense.
Wow. That is grim, but it makes sense. That brings us to the third broken world trade. You would think that the sheer volume of wealth flowing through Africa over the centuries would naturally give rise to massive administrative states. I mean, SCCS Variable 1734 measures trade outside the local community. What is its impact on centralization?
The statistical effect is virtually zero.
I have to pause here. We are talking about the trans-Saharan trade routes. We're talking about the staggering wealth generated by the ivory trade and the horrific, world-altering scale of the Atlantic slave trade. Millions of people, thousands of tons of goods. How does that kind of economic velocity not leave a massive bureaucratic footprint?
Because of the specific nature of what was being traded and how that wealth was distributed. In a healthy Eurasian model, a monarch taxes the grain or spice trade, centralizes that wealth, and uses it to build public infrastructure.
Yeah.
But in Africa, the influx of wealth from slaves and ivory and the firearms that were often traded for them did not go into the coffers of a centralized bureaucracy. It went directly into the hands of local merchants and regional warlords.
It decentralized the firepower.
Exactly. Imagine a fledgling king trying to consolidate power over a territory. Suddenly, European or Arab merchants arrive on the coast or the borders. They're trading modern rifles and massive wealth directly to the king's subordinate chiefs in exchange for captives or ivory.
Oh, man. So those local chiefs now have the military capability to completely ignore the king.
The trade empowered local actors to resist the center. It actively incentivized raiding and kidnapping at the hyper-local level. The wealth didn't act as a unifying glue. It acted as a solvent. It pumped massive resources into the fringes of society, actively dismembering the possibility of a unified, peaceful state.
The external economy was fundamentally predatory, so it created a domestic landscape of predators rather than a unified nation.
Now, any rigorous listener is going to spot a potential flaw in this entire analysis. If the SCCS data shows that density, war, and trade don't predict states in Africa, how do we know the SCCS data isn't just wrong?
It's a very fair question. Estimating the population density of a stateless society in the Congo Basin in the year 1600 involves a lot of anthropological guesswork. I mean, there were no census bureaus taking roll call.
The Harvard researchers totally anticipated this skepticism. To prove their findings weren't just the result of bad historical data, they utilized an econometric technique called two-stage least squares, or 2SLS, using an instrumental variable.
Okay, we definitely need to translate that into human English. Walk us through how a researcher proves historical data is real when they don't have a time machine.
Think of the instrumental variable as a biological lie detector test. The researchers knew that historical population estimates could be biased or inaccurate, so they decided to ignore the human historical record entirely for a moment. Instead, they looked at the raw, physical planet. They used a variable called agricultural potential.
Meaning the quality of the soil, the predictability of the rainfall, the average temperature, basically the physical capacity of the earth to grow food.
Correct. As a biological rule, across the entire globe, agricultural potential is highly predictive of human population density. Better soil invariably leads to more people. That is a baseline fact of our species.
So if the SCCS population estimates are accurate, they should align closely with the underlying agricultural potential of the land.
Exactly. The researchers ran the first stage of the 2SLS test. They checked if agricultural potential predicted population density globally. And it did. The statistical F value, which measures the strength of this relationship, was a very robust 13.67 for the global sample.
The biology works.
But then they isolated the African SCCS societies. They checked if the rich soil in Africa predicted high population density the way it does everywhere else. The F value collapsed to 3.6.
Wait, what does that actually mean in practice?
It means that in Africa, the natural environment's capacity to support human life did not reliably translate into massive centralized populations in the way Eurasian models predict. There's a fundamental disconnect between the potential of the land and the political structures that emerged on it.
Wow, so even when you remove human error and just look at the raw soil, the rules still fail.
Yes. In the second stage of the test, they used that flawless, raw geographic data to predict political centralization. And the result was final. Globally, the correlation was strong and highly significant. In Africa, the coefficient remained statistically zero.
That is insane.
The researchers exhausted every mathematical avenue to find the Eurasian model in Africa, and it simply is not there.
So we really have to face the core mystery of this entire deep dive. If the environment didn't stop them, if they had fertile soil, massive populations, and wealth, why did these African societies remain stateless?
The most profound insight of this research is that the lack of a centralized state wasn't a failure of capability. It wasn't that these societies were behind on some evolutionary timeline. The SCCS data, combined with deep anthropological history, suggests that remaining stateless was a conscious, highly sophisticated, and generational social choice.
Think about the willpower required to sustain that. Societies like the Tiv or the Kikuyu lived for centuries alongside centralized empires. They saw kings, they saw armies, and they saw the wealth it could produce. Yet they collectively looked at the prospect of absolute power and engineered their cultures to make it impossible.
They developed specific social technologies designed to act as defense mechanisms against tyranny. Anthropologists refer to these structures broadly as cross-cutting cleavages. And one of the most prominent effective forms of this in pre-colonial Africa was the institution of age sets.
Now, the concept of an age set is incredibly foreign to a modern Western listener, so we really need to break down exactly how this mechanism functioned on a human level.
Okay, imagine if the primary organizing principle of your life had absolutely nothing to do with your biological family. Your ultimate loyalty wasn't to your parents, your siblings, or the prestige of your last name. Instead, your highest unbreakable allegiance was to a cohort of people born in the exact same 3 to 5 year window as you, drawn from across the entire society.
It's like the ultimate high school graduating class. But instead of just signing a yearbook, you undergo grueling, sometimes life-threatening initiation rituals together. You bleed together. You share secrets.
The initiation binds you fundamentally. Once you are inducted into your age set, that cohort becomes your primary political and social unit. You transition through the phases of life together. Your age set might be assigned the role of warriors for a decade. Then as a group, you transition to being the political adjudicators, the elders who settle disputes.
You govern together and you fight together. But how does this specific structure stop a king from rising to power?
Well, we have to look at how states form in Eurasia. European and Asian state building is almost entirely based on vertical lineages.
Right, family trees.
Exactly. Single family, the Bourbons in France, the Tudors in England, the Ming Dynasty in China, accumulates wealth, land, and military power. They dominate the rival families, and the patriarch of that family declares himself king. Power flows vertically down the bloodline.
If the Smith family has the most swords, the Smiths rule the valley, and the son of the Smith patriarch inherits the throne.
Now drop that ambition into an African society structured by age sets. A patriarch of a wealthy, prominent family decides he wants to be king. He wants to centralize power, subjugate the neighboring families, and establish a dynasty. What is his first move?
He has to raise an army. He goes to his sons, his nephews, his immediate relatives, and tells them to take up arms against the rival families.
But under the age set system, his son's primary loyalty is not to him. It is to their age set, and their age set horizontally cuts across all bloodlines. The cohort includes the sons of the rival families that the patriarch is trying to conquer.
Oh, wow. So the patriarch's own sons would have to violate their deepest sacred oaths and attack their initiation brothers.
And they just won't do it. Furthermore, the elder age sets, comprising men from all the various lineages, instantly recognize the threat. Because the loyalty cuts horizontally across the entire society, the community can immediately mobilize a unified response against the aspiring tyrant. The patriarch's power base evaporates before he can even swing a sword.
It is a perfectly engineered power shredder. Any individual trying to accumulate vertical dynastic power is instantly caught in a web of horizontal loyalties that rips their ambition to pieces. It makes the mathematics of monarchy impossible.
Age sets were just one tool. Many societies also utilize secret societies, which functioned on a similar principle. You were initiated into a powerful cult or guild that required absolute loyalty, drawing members from diverse lineages and geographic areas. These overlapping networks ensure that no single plan could ever monopolize violence or authority.
They looked at the strict project manager of the centralized state, recognized the inherent threat of exploitation and oppression, and built a social architecture that guaranteed human equality.
They achieved a level of egalitarianism and freedom from top-down exploitation that Eurasian peasants, locked into feudal serfdom, honestly could not even fathom.
But the architecture of history is cruel. Every choice has a shadow. If this decentralized anti-tyranny system was so successful at protecting equality, what was the hidden cost?
To measure that cost, Osafo-Kwaako and Robinson went back to the SCCS dataset. They isolated the African societies that remained stateless and compared their technological and economic outcomes to the societies that did centralize.
And the data presents a brutal, uncompromising bill for that freedom.
It really does. Let's look at the foundational building blocks of what we consider modern civilization. The researchers analyzed the correlation between political centralization and the development of written language and formal record keeping. The correlation coefficient is 0.67.
That is a massive statistical relationship. Writing doesn't just emerge from a vacuum. It is a technology usually invented to track taxes, inventory, and laws, things that only a centralized state actually cares about.
Then they looked at physical security and the enforcement of laws. The correlation between a centralized state and the existence of a formal police force is an astounding 0.927.
Almost a one-to-one guarantee. Without a state, you don't have impartial law enforcement. You just have feuding families or, at best, ad hoc groups of elders trying to cool down a conflict before it spirals into a blood feud.
The economic data is equally stark. The correlation between political centralization and the sophisticated use of money and credit is 0.48.
Let's pause on credit for a second, because credit is the engine of modern wealth. To loan someone money, you need absolute trust that they will pay you back in the future. In a stateless society, you can only lend to people you personally know, or perhaps members of your age set.
Because there is no external enforcement mechanism. If a stranger defaults on a loan, who do you appeal to? There is no court. Who enforces the contract? There is no sheriff. Without a centralized state to act as a neutral arbiter, the radius of trust is tiny. Consequently, the SCCS data shows that in stateless African societies, formal banking and external credit systems simply could not evolve.
The most physical manifestation of this trade-off, though, has to be infrastructure. The data tracks advanced land transport routes. We aren't talking about footpaths through the bush. We are talking about improved trails for pack animals, built bridges, and unpaved roads designed for wheeled transport.
And the development of that infrastructure is tightly, immutably bound to centralization. If you look at pre-colonial Africa, the only societies capable of projecting massive public works across the landscape were the centralized powers, the Asante Empire, the Buganda, Dahomey, Ethiopia.
Because roads require two things that only a state possesses: the power to conscript and organize massive amounts of labor, and the military monopoly to ensure that merchants traveling on those roads aren't instantly robbed. If you shred the central authority, you shred the road network.
This is the tragic paradox at the heart of the Great Divergence.
The societies in Africa that were the most vigilant, the most brilliant at designing social structures to protect human dignity, the ones who fiercely defended their autonomy from kings and warlords, inadvertently locked themselves out of the future.
By using age sets and cross-cutting cleavages to destroy the power of the center, they successfully prevented the rise of a tyrant. But in doing so, they also destroyed the only mechanism capable of minting currency, organizing courts, and building the infrastructure required to participate in the coming industrial revolution.
They won the battle for equality, but they lost the war for long-term economic development. The 40x wealth gap we see today isn't just the result of bad soil or external conquest. It is the echoing, centuries-long consequence of a society choosing freedom over the grim utility of the state.
It really forces a complete recalibration of how we judge historical progress. We tend to view the rise of the state as a triumph of human organization. But viewed through the lens of the Tiv or the Kikuyu, the state is an engine of exploitation that must be resisted at all costs. Their tragedy was that the modern global economy requires that engine to function.
The implications of this are so vast they bleed directly into the anxieties of the present day. We're essentially looking at a historical mirror.
Look at the defining technological and cultural movements of the 21st century. The absolute obsession with decentralization.
Oh, it is the buzzword of our era.
We look at our massive centralized institutions, the federal governments, the central banks, the monopolistic tech giants that control our data, and we are terrified of their power. We feel exactly the same fear of the center that the stateless African societies felt centuries ago.
So we are inventing our own modern social technologies to dismantle them. We are building cryptocurrencies and blockchain ledgers to bypass the central banking system. We are creating decentralized autonomous organizations, DAOs, to run companies without a CEO. We are looking to decentralized AI networks to strip power away from the tech monopolies.
We are actively writing code designed to act as a digital age set. You're engineering cryptographic protocols whose entire purpose is to make it mathematically mathematically impossible for any single node, any single authority to seize control of the network. We are building the ultimate modern power shredders.
And we are cheering for it. We celebrate the dismantling of the center in the name of democratization, privacy, and ultimate human autonomy.
But the African SECS data stands as a massive flashing warning light across history.
If we successfully execute this vision, if we manage to digitally shred the power of the central authorities and achieve this hyper-decentralized utopia, are we walking blindfolded into the exact same trap?
We really must ask ourselves, if we destroy the center, who builds the roads? Who regulates the AI safety protocols? Who coordinates the massive global response required for climate change or the next pandemic?
Will we finally achieve our ultimate decentralized freedom, only to wake up one day and realize we have systematically dismantled the exact public goods we need to survive the next century?
The great illusion of history is assuming the bridge will always be there. Sometimes the danger isn't that the bridge collapses. The real danger is designing a society so focused on individual freedom that it simply forgets how to build the bridge in the first place.